Today we're going to talk about grace works. Not grace versus works, but how grace works. And we're going to allow Paul to tell us that. And I've been taking you through Romans. I didn't ever want to call it a series, but it has been, because for about the past 6 weeks, we've been going through Romans, starting with Romans chapter 1, and we've now found ourselves up to Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 3, and that's our text for the message today. Generally speaking, I use the New Living Translation. That's the Bible that's in front of you. I don't know what your particular translation of the Bible you like. For instance, mine is the New King James Version. That's what I study from. But I do like the New Living Translation. But this morning I'm using the Message. It's more of a paraphrase, I understand that, but it really strikes me that the point that Paul's trying to make is really, I think, very well summed up in the Message. So it's Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. This is Paul. So what do we do? Keep on sinning so God can keep on forgiving? I should hope not. If we've left the country where sin is sovereign, how can we still live in our old house there? Or didn't you realize we packed up and left there for good? That is what happened in baptism. When we went under the water, we left the old country of sin behind, and when we came up out of the water, we entered into the new country of grace. A new life in a new land. So I was thinking to myself, what exactly does a grace-driven Christian look like? I appreciated what Curtis had to say this morning, kind of repeating a comment that I've made to you, that I've concluded that the Bible is written at a level that's probably akin to a fifth grader. And if you've ever watched the game show, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? I can tell you that I would have flunked that show, because in those questions they've asked those fifth graders, I could have never answered half of them correctly. But I got to thinking about it, and something Curtis said is that, well, the more I read the Bible, the deeper it gets. And I just wanted to share with you that you can take a fifth grader, let's say to the Stephen Birch Aquarium, and show them an aquarium, and a fifth grader will understand in context what that aquarium is. But unless you stay there a little longer and ponder the depths of the aquarium from the surface to the bottom, you don't completely understand what that aquarium is in its totality. You only see it from the fifth grader's perspective, and that's just this awesome piece of glass with these pretty fish floating back and forth. But if you are a person that wants to study, maybe marine biology, you start understanding how all these species interact with one another and how algae is an appropriate function given certain contexts, and the function of seaweed, etc., etc., etc. And the deeper you go into the aquarium, the more you understand about the aquarium. But at least on its surface, as a fifth grader, you know it for what it is, and that's an aquarium. So I was thinking, okay, applying that same kind of concept, what does a grace-driven Christian really look like? In Romans chapter 6, Paul asks a very crucial question. How can we who died to sin still live in it? And that's verse 2 from the text that we just talked about, but this is from the Revised Standard Version. How can we who have been made righteous and made right not live righteous lives? How can we who have been loved, Paul inquires, not love in return? How can we who have been blessed not bless? How can we who have been given grace not live graciously? And you get the impression in reading Romans chapter 6 that Paul is just a little stunned with the idea that an alternative to those questions could even remotely exist. How could grace result in anything other than gracious living? So he asks then this question, so what do we do? Keep on sinning so that God can keep on forgiving? And if you want me to get a little theological with you this morning, there is a term for this idea. It's called antinomianism. Anti meaning against, and nomos meaning the moral law. And the promoters of this kind of philosophy see grace as a reason to do bad rather than to do good. Grace, in short, grants them a license to just keep on sinning. The worse I act, the better God seems. And this isn't the first time that Paul has talked about this, because if you remember back in Romans chapter 3, verse 7, he throws out this hypothetical referring to antinomianism, or this idea that I should just continue to sin so I get more grace. He says, a person might say, well, when I lie, it really gives him the glory because my lie shows God's truth. Do you see? Do you see what Paul is arguing? He is suggesting that there are those who would just say, well, I'm going to lie because in my lying, eventually God's truth will out, and because of that, God will be praised because I'm a liar. What a scam. You know? What a scam. I mean, mothers in this audience, you wouldn't tolerate that. I mean, can you imagine your teenager saying to you, Mom, I'll keep my room messy so that the whole neighborhood can see what a great housekeeper you are. Thank you. Right. A boss wouldn't let an employee say, you know, the reason why I'm so lazy is to give you an opportunity to display your forgiveness. No one respects the beggar who refuses to work, who then says, I'm just giving the government an opportunity to show its benevolence. Does that sound familiar during this election season? You've heard these arguments before. We wouldn't tolerate, as Christians in this place, that kind of attitude, and we wouldn't do it. Or would we? Maybe we don't sin so God can give us His grace, but do we ever sin knowing that He will? Do we ever compromise tonight, knowing that we'll confess tomorrow? It's easy to be like the guy who was visiting in Las Vegas. As I have shown you up here, you know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So this guy is going to Las Vegas, and he calls the preacher, and he wants to know the hours for the following Sunday's services. So the preacher, he's impressed by this guy's phone call. And he says, you know, most people who come to Las Vegas don't really think a whole lot about going to church. And the guy says, oh, I'm not coming to Las Vegas to go to church. I'm coming for the gambling and the parties and the wild women. And if things turn out just half as good as I have in my mind, I'm going to need church on Sunday. And is that, church, the intent of grace? Is God's goal to promote disobedience? I don't think so. Paul, in writing to Titus, chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, says the following. Grace teaches us not to live against God, nor do the evil things that the world wants to do. Instead, grace teaches us to live now in a wise and a right way, and in a way that shows we serve God. You see, God's grace has released us from selfishness. So why would you even want to return to where you were before? Think of it in this context. Sin put you in prison. Sin locked you behind the bars and left you in a cell of guilt and shame and deception and fear. Sin did nothing but shackle you to a wall of misery. And then Jesus came and paid the bill, paid for your bail. He served your time. He satisfied your penalty and set you free. Christ died, and when you cast your lot in with Him as a Christian, your old self died too. The only way that we can ever be set free from this prison of sin is to serve its penalty. And in this case, the penalty for sin is death. So for you to be released from this prison of sin, someone has to die. And it's either you or a heaven-sent sacrifice. And that death occurred on Calvary's cross. And when Jesus died, you died to sin's claim on your life, and therefore you are free. What you see overhead is a picture, and it's near São José dos Campos in Brazil, and it's actually a very remarkable facility that you see on the street there. You see, 20 years ago, the Brazilian government decided to turn over a prison to two Christians. The institution was renamed Humaita, and the plan was to run a prison, of all things, on Christian principles. And with the exception of two full-time staff people at Humaita, all of the work is done by the inmates themselves. Families outside the prison adopt an inmate with whom to work during and then after that inmate's term. And the late Chuck Colson visited this prison and made the following report. When I visited Humaita, I found the inmates smiling, particularly the murderer who held the keys and opened the gates and let me in. My guide escorted me to the notorious prison cell that was once used for torture. Today, he told me, that block houses only one single inmate. And as we reached the end of the long concrete corridor and he put the key in the lock, he paused and asked, "Are you sure you want to go in?" "Of course," I replied impatiently. "I've been in isolation cells all over the world." Slowly, he swung open the massive door, and I saw the prisoner in that punishment cell. A crucifix, beautifully carved by the Humaita inmates, with the prisoner Jesus Christ hanging on the cross. And my guide said softly to me, "He's doing time for the rest of us." You see, church, Christ has taken your place. There's no need for you to remain in that cell any longer. I mean, have you ever heard about a released prisoner who wanted to go back to prison? I don't think so. I mean, when the doors swing open to that institution, the prisoners leave. The thought of a person preferring jail over freedom doesn't make any sense. I mean, it just doesn't compute for us. Once the penalty has been paid, why live under the bondage of your imprisonment any longer? You've been discharged, church, from the penitentiary of sin. Why in heaven's name would you ever want to set foot in that prison again? Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 6, continuing now, verses 6 and 7. Our old life died with Christ on the cross so that our sinful selves would have no power over us and we would not be slaves to sin. Anyone who has died is made free of sin's control. Now, he's not saying that it's not impossible for believers to sin. That's not what he's suggesting. In a rather blunt reference, I think he's basically saying it's stupid to continue to sin. What does the prison have that you desire? What does your former prison have anything to cause you to be attracted, to want to go back? I mean, do you miss the guilt? Are you homesick for your dishonesty? Do you have fond memories of being lied to and forgotten about? I mean, was life better when you were in prison and you were dejected and rejected? Do you have a longing to once again see a sinner look at you in the mirror? It makes no sense to want to go back to prison. But not only has this price been paid for your release, your bail has been paid, but a vow has also been made by you. Romans chapter 6, verse 3, did you forget that all of us became part of Christ when we were baptized? And baptism was no casual custom for Paul. It was no kind of ho-hum ritual or something just like, yeah, that's just what we all do. Baptism was and is, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21, a pledge made to God from a good conscience. Paul's very high regard for baptism is demonstrated in the fact that he knew that all of his readers had been instructed in its importance. Romans chapter 6, verse 2, you have been taught. You have been taught that when we were baptized into Christ, we were baptized into His death. And so Paul is talking about what kind of amnesia do you have? I mean, it's like a bride who would be horrified to see her new husband flirting with the women at the wedding reception. Paul asks, come on, kids, did you forget your vows somewhere along the line? I mean, baptism is a vow, right? It's a sacred vow by the believer to follow Christ. And just as a wedding celebrates the fusion of two hearts, baptism celebrates the union of sinner with Savior. We became part of Christ when we were baptized. Romans 6, verse 3. We became part of Christ when we were baptized. So let me ask you this. Do you think that the bride and the groom understand all of the implications of their vows and their wedding and their marriage? No, they don't. Do they know every challenge or threat that they will ever face in their marriage? No, they don't. But they do know that they love each other and vow to be faithful to the end. And when a willing heart enters the waters of baptism, does he know the implications of the vow? No. Does she know every temptation or challenge she's going to face? No. But both know the love of God and are responding to Him. You see, to return to sin after sealing our souls in baptism is like committing adultery on your honeymoon. I mean, can you imagine the distraught bride discovering her husband in the arms of the maid of honor only days after hearing his vows at the altar? Among her many sizzling words, and that's probably putting it mildly, would likely be the following question: have you forgotten what you said to me? And similarly, God asks the same question of us. Does our union mean nothing to you? Is our covenant so fragile that you would choose the arms of a harlot over mine? Who in their right mind would want to abandon those vows? Who will care for you more than Jesus? Have we forgotten what life was like before our baptism? Have we forgotten the mess that we were in before we were united with Him? And I choose the word mess intentionally because I'd like to share with you a mess that I'm glad personally I am out of. And that would be my college dormitory. Of all the names I've ever been called, and there have been many, no one has ever accused me of being a neat freak. Some people have a high threshold of pain. I have a high threshold of sloppiness. Not that my mom didn't try, and in fact, not that my mom didn't succeed, because as long as I was under her roof, I stacked my plate and I picked up my shorts. But once I was free indeed. And most of my life, quite honestly, I've just been a closet slob. Because I was very slow to see the logic of neatness. I mean, why make up the bed today if you're just going to sleep in it later tonight? Right? I mean, does it make any sense to wash the dishes after only one meal? Isn't it easier to leave your clothes on the floor at the foot of the bed so that they will be available for you the next morning when you put them on? Is anything really gained by putting the little cap on the tube of toothpaste tonight when you're just going to use that same toothpaste tomorrow? You're right. And I was as compulsive as anyone. Only I was compulsive about being messy. Because for me, life was too short to match your socks. I mean, if you couldn't match your socks, just go out and buy longer pants, right? And then I got married. And I became a new man because I had been exposed to my wife's much higher standard. And I say all that to say this: isn't that what has happened to us as Christians? Haven't we been exposed now to the higher standard of Jesus Christ? And isn't that what's at the heart of Paul's argument? What he is saying is, how could we who have been freed from sin want to return to it? We're sloppy. We were indulgent. We didn't even know we were slobs until we met Jesus. And then he moved in. Things began to change. What we threw around at one time, now we start to begin to put away. What we neglected before, we begin to clean up now. What had been clutter at one time now starts to become order out of that mess. Oh, there are and will always be occasional lapses of thought and deed on all of our parts. But by and large, our house through Jesus Christ is in order. So go back to that old mess? I mean, are you kidding? That's what Paul says. In the past, you were slaves to sin. You had that messy dorm room. Sin controlled you. But thank God you fully obeyed the things that you were taught. You were made free from sin, and now you are slaves to what? To goodness. Romans chapter 6, verses 17 and 18. So, can a discharged prisoner return to confinement? Well, yes. But if so, let that prisoner remember the gray walls and the long nights of solitary confinement. Can a newlywed forget his or her vows? Yes, they can. But let them remember the holy vow that they took and his beautiful bride. Can a converted slob once again be messy? Yes. But let him or me consider the difference between the filth of yesterday and the purity of today. Can one who has been given a free gift not share that gift with others? I suppose that could happen. But let him remember that the gift that he or she received was freely given. Let him remember that all of life is a gift of grace. And let him remember that the call of grace is to live a gracious life. And church, as Paul would say it, that's how grace works. True Christian desires to be free from sin, not to sin freely. Our lives are not supposed to be the antinomianism, the example that, well, since God is gracious, if I sin more, I'll get more grace. Paul is saying that's an absurd argument because no one would want to return back to the place where they were, especially if you considered the price that was paid to get you out of jail. Remember the Monopoly game? Remember, occasionally you'd land on chance or whatever that other opportunity was, and occasionally you would get the card that said, "Get out of jail free." Y'all have been given that card. You all have been given the card that says, "Get out of jail free." Because it is free to you. You don't have to pay a thing. It cost Jesus Christ his life to give you that opportunity. And so the question is asked of you in this church, but also of the world. If that kind of gift has been given to you freely, why wouldn't you accept it? And people work so hard to reject Jesus. They work so hard to reject that there may be a God. They work so hard in rejection what usually could be understood by a fifth grader. It is not complicated, church. It's easy to understand. But as that relationship develops, yes, you start exploring issues that become deeper and deeper and deeper. The Word is like that aquarium that I was describing to you earlier. I mean, if you just want to go through and read the Word, you can, and it's like floating on the top of the aquarium. There's no depth to it, but you've read it. But if you allow the Word to start sinking into your hearts and being applied in your lives, you start going deeper and deeper and deeper into the aquarium, seeing things that you've never seen before. The aquarium never changed, right? It's the same aquarium, but your perspective has because of your maturity and your depth and your relationship with Jesus. I think virtually everyone here is a Christian. So you're right, Steve, I'm preaching to the choir from that perspective. But even though all of you might be Christians, and thank God if all of you are, there is still something about your relationship with Jesus Christ that I'm asking you to start exploring at a deeper level. Do we feel sometimes as Christians, well, what goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas? Can I just go out on Friday and completely destroy my life knowing that I can come to church on Sunday and it'll all be okay? Honestly, church, I think there's a little bit of that in all of us. And that's why Paul is writing. So it's not to suggest that that's not an impulse that some of us have, but it is to suggest that, look, this is the way that you might be feeling, but I want you to understand why you need to work through that, because it's an immature response to a very serious situation, and that is, shall I continue in sin so that grace may abound? Heaven forbid. Don't you know that when you came into contact with Jesus through baptism, you put on Jesus? He sets you free. So why would you want to go back to the mess that you had before? Sometimes, unfortunately, as Christians, especially those of us who have been Christians for a long time, we have a bit of amnesia. Because what I've discovered is that sometimes people who are recent converts to the faith, who have some maturity, really understand that they are coming out of some really bad circumstances, and they are so grateful that they've been forgiven. And they have an intensity to their spirituality and to their relationship with Jesus that, quite honestly, sometimes I envy. Because I grew up in the church, and I didn't create some of the messes that I know other people have done because they weren't Christians. And unfortunately for me, because I don't have all those messes to be thinking back on, sometimes I can look at grace and it becomes a bit cheap. And that's a tragedy. And it's something I personally struggle with because there's nothing cheap about God's grace. He gave His only begotten Son so that you could have life eternally. But it required that Son to be murdered on a cross so that you could have your get out of jail card free. So regardless of your life and your circumstances, we all ought to be appreciative of the mess that we were in and now the children that we can become. So we're going to sing Amazing Grace. We've sang that song now probably the past 2 or 3 times over the past 6 weeks, 7 weeks. And it's a song that all of us know. But I just want you again to soak in what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 6 and then juxtapose that to how amazing grace is. Let's stand and sing.